Hello, and welcome to another episode of Teaching with Inquiry Live. Tonight, I want to revisit a very popular topic that I had my friend Shauna Rao from the Rowdy Teacher. She came on to an episode in August, and we talked all about spiraling math, and that was episode number 61. So today we're going to do a review. It's been about 3 months since we did that episode, and I wanted to share tonight with you what math actually looks like in my classroom 3 months in to using a spiraling type of pedagogy in my classroom in math. So that is what we're talking about tonight. So if you are new to the Teaching with Inquiry show, thank you so much for joining us. My name is Patty. I'm a 4-5 split grade teacher here in Ontario, Canada, and I am also the teacher, author, and blogger behind madlylearning.com. So if you do want to go check out the original episode that Shauna and I did in August for episode 61, you can find that at www.teachingwithinquiry.com. And again, that's episode 61. So spiraling math. So coming back into the classroom, one of my goals this year was to use more of a spiraled math approach in my classroom. I had dabbled with it a few times here and there, unit as it lended itself appropriately in the past, but I really wanted to adopt this more full force this year and mix things up and change sort of how my math program was going to run, which is why I had Shauna on the show, because this is something Shauna had been doing in her classroom for a while. And for me, she sometimes is the go-to expert. And I know that Shauna and I often, whenever we're talking teaching, we realize pretty quickly that we are similar in how we approach teaching and learning in our classrooms. So that's why she came on. Now, when we were talking about spiraling, we weren't talking necessarily about just your bell work where every day you give them a new question from a new strand. That's not exactly what we were talking about in spiraling. What we were meaning to impart upon others is what we meant by spiraling was looking at the curriculum and revisiting topics over and over, but we were looking in more of a holistic approach, whereas we didn't necessarily say it was a static look at different strands every day, but a more holistic approach to math where multiple strands would need to be pulled in to solve bigger problems. So it was definitely something where you had to kind of wrap your head around this, moving away from a unit and moving more towards a math approach that allowed you to use multiple strands throughout your teaching and learning. So the way we broke that down was looking at your week of math instruction. And we looked specifically at how Shauna was doing that in her classroom, where she would do a 3-part lesson for math that started going over the 2 days, say Monday and Tuesday. You would do a 3-part math lesson with your students where you do your getting started, you're working on it, and your reflection and consolidation at the part. And you would stretch that 3-part lesson over those 2 days. The remaining 3 days of your work week for your students would be using practiced targeted approaches through guided math centers. So that's how Shauna was breaking it down. Now, I approached it a little bit differently in the sense that instead of say a 3-part math, I really wanted to look at bigger inquiry type projects that would really drive and guide your instruction. Perhaps if you've been watching this show for a while or know anything about me, using inquiry in my classroom is something that's very familiar. So I wanted to look at projects as a way for me to safely lead into a spiraling approach by using something that was very familiar to me. So beginning in September, I started this journey. Now, there's things that I learned. There's things that I failed at. There's things that I would definitely do differently moving forward and have already started to implement those things. But overall, using this project-based idea where I'm using projects to guide my spiraled math instruction definitely upped the engagement for my students. And they did actually really give me some solid feedback that they loved learning math this way for most of them. So we're going to get talking about that. So the very first thing I did to get started was I simply just had my students join me on our carpet in the center of our classroom. And I asked them, what is something that we can do as a class that would use math? And we brainstormed a whole lot of things. What's something we could plan, an activity or an event that we could plan would require us to use some math to plan it. So we brainstormed, we put things up on chart paper, and they came up with things like a movie day, and they came up with ideas about movie days and parties and soccer tournaments, and I remember all of the other things, but they had a whole chart paper full of different ideas of things that they could do within their classroom that would allow them to use math in multiple ways. So we eventually turned that into collecting that data and taking surveys to figure out which activity we would do. So my students, who are pretty an active group of kids, decided that they were going to plan a soccer tournament. Now we brainstormed the different kinds of math that was going to be needed to plan a soccer tournament, and we listed those out. So after we picked our event by doing some surveys, we then had to kind of think through some of the math that was going to be required for us to be able to plan out this actual soccer tournament. So we looked at things like how many students would be required to be on teams, how many teams would we have, how would we divide our field out on our playground into the appropriate sized soccer fields. How would we set our time? We were given 100 minutes of time to plan our soccer tournament. So how would we use that time? So students really had to look at time and breakdown of area and perimeter and length and a lot of measurement. We got into some decimals during this project. A lot of survey and data collection and time management was definitely in play as students were looking at how to plan the soccer tournament. I was definitely the guide during this event and prompting them as to what happened next. And there was a lot of learning that happened along the way. And there was definitely a lot of math. In fact, through this soccer project and planning a soccer tournament, I can confidently say we probably hit on every single curriculum strand that I'm required to cover, at least one or two expectations per all 5 strands that we're required to cover. So it was quite a robust project that we were able to do. And this took us 2 months to plan. And we definitely had to kind of push it at the end because we needed to get through the project before the weather turned to such that it would be very difficult for us to conduct a tournament outside with all 29 of my students. In the feedback from my students, they really, really liked this project. It inspired them. It got them excited about math. It definitely had them understand that math is not something that's simply used in isolation where we just do addition or we just do measurement, but they definitely saw the interrelationship between the variety of strands that we had to use: probability, decimals, addition, subtraction, area and perimeter, measurement, length, time. All of those things were definitely integrated all within this one project. And for the most part, it worked out really well. Now, some of the things that I did learn in this was sometimes we encountered some math that was scary for my students. We ended up having to figure out algebraic equations. And although it was something that they would be expected to do for a lot of them, seeing letters replacing numbers on the chart paper as we were trying to figure out where a goalpost would go on the end of a made up field. And we had to understand that the goalpost was 34.5 meters or meters wide, which isn't actually what it was, but it was 6.4 meters wide was the goalposts, but yet we had 30.5 meters for the entire width of our soccer field. So where along that width would we put that goalpost? Well, there was decimals and we were measuring in meters, and that stumped my students, especially when we drew it out and we started putting A plus the goalpost that we knew, plus the other side of the field, which would be A, and tried to figure that out. So that was definitely difficult for my students. And I was perhaps not as prepared to coach them through that and guide them through those problems. So there's definitely some things that I've learned and have now put in place in our second project that we can use moving forward. So some of the things that I learned is to really look at the steps that the students need to go through to solve this problem. So our next project that they have voted on and selected is called Let's Eat. And they've decided that they're going to create a meal for somebody else and they will serve it. So they brainstormed that some of the math that was going to be included would definitely be survey and data management. They would need to do some addition and subtraction, perhaps even multiplication and division. There was going to be fractions if they themselves were going to be preparing recipes, as well as learning about money and about area and perimeter, because they'd have to rearrange the tables within our classroom to make sure that they would fit the number of people that they were planning on serving. So some of the things that I learned from the soccer project that I'm applying now into this project is that we are looking at what will students need to learn next? And before they solve that problem in their project, I'm front loading some of the content that they're going to need. So prior to us selecting who we would be serving and what food we would be serving them, we did a quick mini unit on data collection and graphing. So we spent 2 weeks at making different types of graphs, collecting survey data, and looking at bar graphs, line graphs, and double bar graphs. We didn't look at some of the other data collection requirements for the curriculum because we will revisit that with other projects throughout the year, but we definitely stayed focused on what was a bar graph, what was a double bar graph, and we also looked at continuous data for a line graph. So then once we had done that 2 weeks, then we tackled the problem of who were we going to serve and what were we going to serve them. So we've just completed that where students have made a double bar graph to show the votes on what food it is we should be serving our guests, which they have decided will be their parents. So because I've learned from that soccer that I needed to front load that learning for students, I've created little mini units where we're looking at much fewer expectations covered in a shorter term, and then we revisit and repeat. Going forward, the next step will be to plan out the cost and how we're going to pay for this. So we'll be looking at things like money and decimals. So we'll do a 2-week quick unit on decimals, place value of decimals, and money, so that we can then move on to our next step, which will be looking at the cost and how much all of this is going to cost us, as we're going to have to add up the amount of food that's going to be needed for my students. So in terms of what my week looks like, we have sat down as a class and talked about the different steps that we need to go through. I've now put up an anchor chart in my classroom, which has gone through the different steps. What's our next step that we need to go through, and what the math is going to look like. Then before we tackle the problem that the project is giving us, we need to front load some of that math learning and do a bit of practice. So how I'm generally structuring my week is Monday and even perhaps into Tuesday, we're looking at what the next part of our project is going to be, what the math is, whether it's trailing from the previous data. So for instance, today we made our double bar graph based on our data. Starting tomorrow, we'll be moving on to our money and decimals section so that we can tackle the next step in our problem. So Monday, I'm generally reviewing some of our project math that's required and applying some of those mini lessons that we've been doing and applying those into solving our problem's big next step. And then going forward on Tuesday through Friday, I am doing guided math centers. So I'm using 4 different guided math centers. And what I'm doing here is let me just share this with you so that you can see an example of what my math centers look like. So this is an example of what this is what I hand out to students. There's 4 different math centers that I am using with my students. And what is happening? So what's happening for my students is they're going through those 4 centers. So for example, this is the last bar graph. This is the one they were currently working on. So this is what we did where they had to create a bar graph. So this is the last 2 weeks that students were working on this, and they have 4 centers. The first one is a problem solving question that they have to complete that's often mimics or relates some of the math that's going to need to be present for them to solve the big math project question. So I will scaffold and step them up to familiar questions or parts of the big question that we have to ask. So this week's question will be about planning out a quick meal, giving them some prices for their food. All about numbers is I still believe that rote learning is important, especially when it comes down to basic facts. So I do have my students doing time tests to practice their basic addition and subtraction tests at the moment. Multiplication and division will definitely be moved into second term, as that's more of a focus for me in term 2. But I find that this constant practice is good for students to just reflect. Now, each student is differentiated in the fact that they're each given 5 minutes, and their goal is to simply beat their record that they did the previous day. So I have some students that are finishing 100 questions in 5 minutes, and I have some students that can just finish 10 questions in 5 minutes. And that's fine as long as they can see progress on the chart that they're collecting their data in. So they track their results on their addition test in a graph and chart on Google Classroom, which is why it says record your results in Google Classroom there. Time with teachers when they're meeting with me. I initially started with having not have time with teacher as one of the centers, and I had this tech, and then I had decided that I was going to meet with students outside of those 4 centers. What ended up happening is I found that because I wasn't forced to meet with them, this forces me to meet with them and not get distracted by the constant barrage of questions that my students have for me while I'm working. So if I have a center that I have students that are scheduled to come and see me on certain days, it keeps me accountable to make sure that I'm seeing them in a guided math instruction, and as well as it helps my students keep me accountable and keep them accountable to make sure that they are actually meeting with me so that I can observe their math skills in a small group. Now, the amount of data collection that I've been able to get from these small group has meant that my students I'm finding they're moving a little bit quicker because I can respond much quicker to small problems as they encounter them and walk them through, not quite on a one-to-one, but definitely in a small group setting. So I'm actually finding these guided groups, which is the first time I've done them in math, to be pretty powerful and helps to inform my instruction. I'm doing far less whole group instruction and far more small group tailored instruction based on student need and readiness, which also helps because you all know I also teach split. So I can do 2 separate sets of curriculum as well as IEP math instruction and remedial math instruction, all during those guided groups. Now, I meet with those students the entire math period. So they're with me. I'm not bouncing between groups. I'm often meeting with them almost the entire math group, and then I will often help support some of my other students that need to see me more frequently after I've set these students that are with me in that guided math group off on doing an independent task. Hands-on math. Now, I'm going to be exploring this a little bit further next week as I talk about boom cards and how I am using boom cards in my classroom. And I know that might sound strange because I know it's pretty new to a lot of Ontario teachers, but boom cards is a wonderful online source of work for students to do. And it's like flashcards, but they're all digital and the answers for students are tracked. But I'll talk a lot more about that in an upcoming episode. So I will often have boom cards here, or I will simply just have a hands-on math activity where they have to do something with manipulatives or do something a bit more interactive, and they can do the hands-on math with a partner. I do think it's important that there is an activity that they're able to do in a small group or with a partner because of the accountable talk that is present when they work collaboratively with other students. So those are my 4 math centers that I have them go through. And again, we do this 4 days a week. And these are front loaded, and how it's spiraled is because I'm only doing quick, short mini units. Now I'm focused on one strand, generally speaking, in these mini units. But for example, this math was 1 week of math centers, and there was 2 math center weeks in graphing. And with those 2 math center weeks, we were able to cover bar graphs, double bar graphs, continuous line graphs for my grade 5s, as well as collecting of survey data. So there was a lot that we were able to get through in 2 weeks' time using those 4 activities. So some of the things that I'm finding my students are really engaged because they understand that the math we're doing in the 2 weeks is specifically designed to answer that big question that they're very much bought into. They're very excited about the possibility of having their parents being able to come in. They have a lot of ownership in this project because they are choosing the food they're serving. They're choosing who they're serving. Bestills my inquiry heart because I absolutely love seeing how engaged they are in that math learning. Although it might be a little bit different from what we had talked about back in August about spiraling, I think it's really important to also talk about making something fit with your style of teaching. That taking a piece of what you hear another teacher doing, such as listening to Shauna describe how she runs her math program, thinking and reflecting about what that means for you in your classroom, and then doing what works for you and what you're comfortable with. I knew right away I might not be able to do it exactly as Shauna had described, but I could take the ideas that she had talked about and take some of the structures she had used similar to her guided math instruction and really take those and make it work with how I already run my classroom, which is very inquiry-based and very project-driven. So because that's already how I think as a teacher, this was an easier transition. Now, as I continue to move forward, I will continue to push myself to use more spiraled approach. But 3 months in, this is where I'm at. So I am using projects that are guiding my math instruction, and I'm doing quick, short mini units on a variety of strands as they relate to the various problems that we need to solve in our overall big project that students are working on. So that is math. I hope I've made that clear and easy to understand for you. Unfortunately, I don't have pictures. I don't like to take too many pictures of what's happening in my classroom for privacy and confidentiality reasons because my kids' names are all over the stuff that's on our walls. So unfortunately, I have to just describe it here for you. But hopefully you got a sense of how I've taken some of the ideas that we talked about in August and 3 months in, what that looks like in my classroom, some of the things that I've learned, what may not have worked so well for me. Definitely not front loading ahead of time was an error that I made in our soccer project that I have begun to rectify in our Let's Eat project. So these are some of the ways that I am spiraling in my classroom. I hope that gave you an idea or perhaps another perspective of ways that you can use spiraling math in your classroom. So thanks so much for joining me for tonight's episode. If you want more information about tonight's show, if you want to catch the podcast replay or the YouTube replay, you can find, or the transcript for this video, you can find all of that information as well as all of that information for episode 61, which is the original spiraling video. You can find all of that at www.teachingwithinquiry.com. And if you want to learn more about me using inquiry or split grade instruction in your classroom and read all about tonight's video in my corresponding blog post, you will find all of that on my newly redesigned site at www.madlylearning.com. Thanks again so much for joining us. I hope this was a helpful video for you. If you liked it, please click like and share with others. I would really appreciate it. Thanks so much. Talk to you later. Bye for now.